As we approach the 2020 U.S. Census, many groups across the country are working together to make sure that their communities are prepared and participating for federal funding that is associated with the census. One California-based group called Hyecount is doing just that, well ahead of the deadline. So joining me now is their Communications Director Alex Galitsky to explain the reason behind their push for an immigrant community to take part. So you've moved to California from Australia to help Hyecount out to make sure that all Armenians in the state mark their ethnicity specifically on the census. Why do you feel so strongly about helping this cause?
I mean, it's incredibly important for our community to be counted, not just our community, but all communities in California. There's a lot at stake in this census. We're talking about $700 billion in funding every year based on the count that the census is able to get. We're also talking about congressional seats and the apportionment of congressional seats and the allocation of electoral college votes in future elections. And California really has been at the heart of the undercount of the U.S. population based on its large immigrant community and its large undocumented community as well. As a result, there's a huge risk that California could actually lose out on a congressional seat after the apportionment next year. So we're very concerned about ensuring that there is a complete count, both in terms of ensuring we get funding for our communities, but also for the political representation of our communities to not be adversely affected. We've also seen, as I mentioned, in communities, immigrant communities, particularly across California and the country, there is a severe undercount. Using the Armenian community as an example, we estimate as an organization there to be about 1 million Armenians in California alone, but the last census in 2010 recorded fewer than 250,000. So with less than a quarter of our community actually counted in the census, there's a serious risk that we're not going to receive the adequate funds to ensure that our community is serviced for the next 10 years.
So I called you because this also applies to any other community that is considering getting an accurate count on the census. What can anyone else take away from this effort, and what is really the goal here?
As a state, we require every community to participate in the census. And there are a lot of obstacles for the participation of other immigrant communities, and they're all very interrelated factors. We're talking about the misinformation associated with the question of whether or not a citizenship-related question would be included in the census, the issues surrounding mistrust of government that exists amongst many immigrant communities when it comes to, for example, the countries they've migrated from. The Armenian community, for example, and this shares a lot of the same characteristics as other communities. Many of our members have come from countries such as Egypt or Syria, Iraq, Iran, and then as well from the former Soviet Union, Russia, and now Armenia, where the use of statistics and the collection of statistics such as these was often used to surveil their populations for the sake of categorization by the government, which often was very negative in the connotations that it had. So it's understandable that many communities across California, across the country, for that matter, are skeptical as to why the information is being collected and what that means for their security. Although that being said, the census has invested a lot of money in assuring those communities that none of the information collected in the census can be used against you by any court of law or by any government agency or department. So part of the challenge here for all of us is to ensure that there is accurate information about what the census does, how that information is used, and how important it is in terms of funding and congressional seat allocation for our communities to be represented accurately in the census.
And so are you still seeing that kind of apprehension in your efforts as you've been working on this for the last few months?
Absolutely, especially amongst the recent migrant communities. Unfortunately, these communities that have the greatest apprehension towards the census are also the ones that have the most to gain from an accurate count, because we're talking about the provision of language services that will improve accessibility to federally funded services, for example, as well as services that will help immigrant students be enrolled in schools, or language funding for our communities to ensure that our cultural education lives on and isn't stymied at all by a lack of funding. So it is incredibly important, but those communities are the ones that are historically most undercounted and the ones that the Census Bureau and our organizations will have the hardest time actually reaching out to. And we're already seeing that. Why is this information being collected? Some are asking us. We've never seen the outcome of this funding in the past. Why should we participate this time? Why is the government wanting this information from us? There is a lot of misconceptions surrounding why this information is being collected. Part of our work as a community organization and what the Census Bureau and organizations such as the California California Community Foundation, which has been supporting many community-based organizations, is ensuring there are trusted partners in the census process that can reach out to communities and assure them that there is no risk of this information being used against them, and slowly breaking down those misconceptions that are associated with the census from past experience in their home countries.
Do they feel like participating could possibly put a target on their backs? And is there any evidence that this information isn't being gathered and used for different reasons other than funding these communities?
So under Title 13 of the U.S. Code, the information collected in the census cannot be used for any reason other than statistical purposes, and that was upheld in 1982 by the Supreme Court and a number of other decisions over the years. So census workers are held to account throughout the course of their life. There's a 5-year prison sentence if any of this information is revealed, and a $250,000 fine. So there are security measures in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. But nonetheless, there is still an incredible amount of concern out there about what this information is going to be used for. When the citizenship question came up, for example, there was a lot of concern that this might result in undocumented individuals across the state and the country, as well as people on bridging visas, migrant visas that haven't yet achieved the citizenship status here, that they might be under increased pressure or surveillance, or, like you said, have a target on their back. Although that information could never be used against them based on the legal restrictions for the use of that information, there was concern, for example, that this would create a kind of two-tiered system in the determination of how congressional seats were apportioned. So instead of apportioning seats on the basis of the total population of the state, you would apportion seats on the basis of the total voter percentage of a state, which would mean California, which has a 14%, 40% of the population are not citizens, they're immigrants here legally. That would result in a huge undercount and a reapportionment of seats from California to other states. So it's not so much the risks of that information being used for malign purposes, but what questions such as the potential citizenship question, but even the race questions, mean as a deterrent for communities to accurately categorize themselves in the census.
So are you guys also urging people who are undocumented to participate then?
Absolutely. There is, and in our own community, in the Armenian community, we have a large number of undocumented Armenians, and we encourage them to participate because those groups are the ones that could potentially benefit the most from the type of funding that we would hope to be achieved through a complete census count. So we would never advise our community or undocumented members of our community to participate if we weren't assured that that data would not be used against them in any capacity. So the fact that there is no citizenship question in the census does provide us with an easier task when it comes to conveying the importance of the census to the community, encouraging them to participate. But it's important that everyone gets counted, regardless of age, citizenship status, whether they're documented or not, because the funding ultimately helps all of us.
And so this happens every 10 years. How is the 2020 census different than the last decade?
So the biggest difference is to do with the question of race and national origin in the census. In the last census, the categories that were there were white, black, Asian American, and then some other race. This time round, you can actually specify under white, black, Asian American what your specific national origins are. That's part of our campaign, is ensuring that Armenians write in the word Armenian under the relevant racial category to ensure that they are counted as Armenian in the census. But what we have seen, and what is unfortunate, is that there is this continuity in the way in which the census has been structured from 2010 to 2020. There was actually a proposal by the census in 2017 to change the question associated with race and ethnicity. Instead of conflating the two terms, having the term ethnicity or national origin more overtly used in the question, and combining the previous question, question 8, which concerns Hispanic and Latin American origins, with the question about race, to have this all-inclusive question which would ask individuals whether they identify as white, Latin American, Hispanic, African American, Asian American, Middle Eastern or North African, Native American, Pacific Islander, and then some other race as another catch-all option. Unfortunately, that proposal was rejected ultimately, despite the fact that many members of the communities, Latin American communities, as well as Middle East, North African communities, were strongly in favor of introducing that type of census questionnaire, because it more accurately categorized the lived experiences of the people that it was involved in counting. For example, right now, Arab Americans, Arab Muslim Americans would be required to or categorized as white in the census, which is absolutely not reflective of their experience in this country, particularly given restrictions imposed on them on travel and the general discrimination that exists in society. Um, and the separation of the Hispanic and race categories has also resulted in serious undercounting of Latin and Hispanic Americans in the census too. So having and there were actually test results based on surveys conducted when the census first floated the idea of a more inclusive question that resulted in a much higher rate of reporting for these communities when given the option to not only categorize themselves in a more accurate way, but the option to write in what their ethnicity was. So the biggest difference is the fact that you can write in your identity, but there is more things similar between the current census and the 2010 census, disappointingly so based on the proposal of the census back in 2017.
And that's exactly what I was seeing, that there are ethnicities that are being grouped under a category. Like I saw North Africans and Mediterraneans are now being added under the white race on this census. Does that strike you as odd?
It absolutely does. Like I mentioned, the lived experiences of a lot of people who would fall under that category does not reflect the white experience in the United States, for example. It's very confusing for our community in particular because they'll look at question 9 and they'll look at the first option, which says white, and it will say German, Polish, French, and then Egyptian, Lebanese. And many of our members of our community come from Lebanon and Egypt and will naturally be prompted by that suggestion to write those options in and under white. Ultimately, it doesn't change the outcome of the census count. Whether or not you write your identity in under some other race or white, it still gets counted in the end. But the issue here is just in terms of how people self-identify and whether or not being told to categorize themselves as white is going to be a deterrent for many community members who don't see themselves as white, who don't identify as such, believe it to be an exclusionary category that doesn't accurately reflect their experiences, particularly given the state, the general sentiments towards Arab Americans and this political climate. It makes it very difficult for us to encourage a complete count of our community when the categories that are used are so exclusionary.
And it sounds like this goes beyond a personal issue with people because this is tied to federal funding. So if a particular group isn't accurately counted and then they're all grouped under one race like white, does that mean then that they're not getting that funding?
They will be receiving that funding. That isn't necessarily the issue. It's more just in terms of the issue of self-identification, but also.
But then how would they know, for example, Egyptian is who is marking that box as white, and then the Egyptian community would be getting that money for their language resources or whatever else that they have in the community?
So that ultimately, and this is the challenge here, is that the census has created a system where there are greater barriers towards self-identification. So people will be turned off immediately by the white option, and as a result, won't be properly counted. That's the biggest issue here, is that the white box or the restrictive racial categories act as a deterrent. So that's something we're trying to combat. We're actually encouraging our community to check the box some other race, because what we'd like to see in the future is by demonstrating a demand in our community and in other communities that share our interests or come from the same region, to identify separately as some other race, and then hopefully in a future census have a Middle East North Africa category available that would more accurately categorize our communities to be an option. So that's the kind of messaging that we're putting out there, and we've seen many other communities as well encourage their members to write in their ethnicity rather than use the existing categories that the census has made available.
So is there any sort of setback by marking that general box instead of handwriting in your specific ethnicity or national origin?
In terms of perhaps looking at the overall picture and the face of the United States, there is an issue with having all these groups be identified as white for the purposes of just a general macro view of the demographic situation in the United States. Some people have suggested there are political motives behind the catch-all term white as a way of not reflecting the real face of the United States, which is, and the reality is that this is a majority minority country, and that's a fantastic thing. But in categorizing everyone as white, and in some cases, making it seem like categorizing yourself as white is preferable to writing in your ethnicity, it will ultimately result in undercounts of communities. So indirectly, having people identify as white will result in a greater rate of undercounting in the census.
And then I also noticed that Hispanic or Latino is a separate question on the census. Let's say people of that origin end up marking that box specifically to accurately represent who they are. Again, what would you say to these people who feel like that could be making them a target for anything other than just this federal funding?
The biggest risk here is actually not identifying as those groups. If you're not identifying as Latin American, Hispanic, there is a greater risk of funding not being given to those communities. So the problem, and this kind of goes back to the point I was making about distinguishing these categories, resulting in kind of producing a deterrent factor for communities to accurately categorize and identify themselves. It's important that communities be educated to the fact that this information cannot be used for anything other than producing statistics. And the greatest risk and the greatest negative outcome that could come from not identifying, because that would result in services not being provided to those specific communities. Unfortunately, a lot of migrant communities, particularly Hispanic and Latin American communities, do not receive funding because they are severely undercounted, because there is a belief that the information collected in the census will be used against them. And this kind of just perpetuates the absence of funding that these communities receive from the federal government.
And so how can a person participate? Is this something they have to wait to come in their traditional mailbox, or is it online as well?
So this is the first year the census can be completed online. The census will be mailing out postcards to every home address, and that will come with a 12-digit code that can be used to fill out the census online at my2020census.gov. So it is the first time that this is happening. That presents its own challenges, particularly in terms of accessibility for lower income communities and the elderly communities, which are also at the highest risk of being undercounted. Paper questionnaires will be sent to the areas that are designated hardest to count, so there will still be that option, but adding this layer of online filing for the census does have its unique challenges in terms of educating communities. But it is important to know that the census can be completed online or by phone as well as by mail traditionally.
All right, thank you so much, Alex Galitsky with Hyecount, for joining me and talking about this upcoming 2020 census.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.